The Old Kingdom of Egypt, often called the Age of the Pyramids, represented one of the most stable and powerful periods in ancient history. From roughly 2686 to 2181 BC, Egypt was unified under divine kingship, with pharaohs ruling as living gods who maintained cosmic order, or Ma'at. Monumental pyramids at Giza symbolized immense state power, advanced engineering, and centralized authority. A strong bureaucracy collected taxes, organized labor, and managed irrigation along the Nile. Agricultural surplus sustained cities, temples, and royal projects. Trade networks extended into Nubia, the Levant, and the Sinai. For centuries, the Old Kingdom appeared unshakable, yet this stability depended on delicate balances between environment, economy, and political authority. When those balances failed, the foundations of the Old Kingdom began to crack, revealing that even Egypt's most iconic era was vulnerable to collapse. The primary cause of the Old Kingdom's collapse was a prolonged environmental crisis caused by repeated failures of the Nile's annual flooding. Egypt's entire agricultural system depended on predictable inundations that deposited fertile silt across farmland. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, climate shifts reduced rainfall in East Africa, weakening the Nile floods. Several consecutive low inundations devastated harvests, leading to widespread food shortages. Grain surpluses that once supported the royal court, priests, officials, and laborers disappeared. Without surplus, the state could no longer function at its previous scale. Environmental instability directly attacked the foundation of Egypt's power. The failure of the Nile was not a temporary disruption, but a sustained crisis that undermined economic security, social stability, and confidence in divine kingship. As agricultural production collapsed, the Old Kingdom's economy entered a severe crisis. The Egyptian state relied on grain taxes to pay officials, support temples, and organize massive construction projects. When harvests failed, taxation became impossible. Workers went unpaid, state-sponsored buildings stopped, and trade declined sharply. Egypt no longer had surplus goods to exchange with neighboring regions. Economic contraction spread rapidly from the countryside into urban centers. The rigid economic system, designed for abundance and stability, lacked the flexibility to adapt to scarcity. As resources disappeared, the state's ability to govern weakened dramatically. Economic collapse was not a separate problem, but a direct consequence of environmental failure that spread instability throughout every level of society. As the food crisis deepened, the Old Kingdom's political system began to fail in a very specific way. It lost legitimacy. Pharaohs were expected to guarantee prosperity and Ma'at, the balance that kept the world functioning. When consecutive low Nile floods produced hunger and instability, many Egyptians no longer saw the king as an effective guardian of order. At the same time, the central government's ability to move grain and enforce policy weakened because it no longer had reliable surplus to command. Provincial governors, the nomarchs, expanded their authority by controlling local storage, local labor, and local security. What had once been a unified state increasingly behaved like a set of semi-independent regions. Officials who once depended on royal appointments began to build loyalty networks of their own. The divine image of kingship did not vanish overnight, but it steadily lost the practical power that sustained it. Once the provinces became the real centers of power, Egypt's crisis turned from hardship into breakdown. The Old Kingdom had depended on coordination, maintaining canals, organizing grain storage, distributing food during shortages, and moving labor where it was needed. When nomarchs acted independently, cooperation weakened and competition grew. Regional leaders focused on protecting their own communities and reputations, sometimes at the expense of neighbors. Infrastructure suffered because large projects required national planning and shared resources. Canals and local irrigation works deteriorated, reducing productivity even when floods improved. Administrative records and tax delivery became unreliable, making it harder for the royal court to predict needs or respond quickly. Disorder also grew because justice and enforcement varied from region to region. The state did not simply lose control in one dramatic event, it became unable to function as a single machine. Fragmentation multiplied the damage of low Nile floods and made famine harder to contain. The Old Kingdom could have survived a short crisis, but the main cause remained active for too long. Repeated Nile failures kept agriculture unstable across multiple years. Even when some areas received better flooding, the broader system was already weakened by damaged infrastructure, poor coordination, and shrinking reserves. Population pressure made recovery harder because more people depended on the same farmland and the same grain stores. As hunger continued, families migrated toward areas with better conditions, draining labor from struggling regions and weakening local production further. The royal government could not restart major state projects because it lacked surplus, reliable taxation, and nationwide organization. This is what made the collapse structural. A system built on predictable inundation and predictable administration could not adapt to long-term uncertainty. By the time the climate pattern improved, the Old Kingdom's political and economic machinery had already come apart, and rebuilding it required a new era, new leadership, and new institutions. A major secondary cause of the Old Kingdom's collapse was social strain that widened into open distrust. When food became scarce, distribution and access mattered as much as total supply. Local elites and officials often had better access to stored grain, while many farmers and laborers faced harsher conditions. This inequality intensified anger and weakened the sense that society was protected by a fair, divinely ordered system. The pharaoh's sacred status depended on visible results, stable floods, full granaries, and predictable justice. As those results disappeared, belief in the old order faded, and people sought protection from local patrons rather than distant kings. Communities became less willing to provide labor or taxes to a state that could not guarantee survival. Social cohesion, which had once made large-scale projects possible, broke down into regional and local loyalties. This did not replace the environmental crisis, but it amplified it, turning hardship into disintegration by removing trust, cooperation, and shared commitment to the centralized state. Trade decline was another secondary force that reduced Egypt's ability to absorb shock. The Old Kingdom's economy was not isolated. It relied on exchange for materials like copper from Sinai, stone resources, and luxury items that supported elite networks and temple activity. When agricultural surplus shrank, Egypt had less to offer in trade and fewer resources to organize expeditions. As insecurity grew, routes became harder to protect and less profitable to maintain. Reduced trade weakened major centers that depended on regular inflows and on the prestige that exchange created. It also reduced the state's ability to rebuild infrastructure, equip officials, and sustain temple economies that once stabilized society through redistribution. Trade decline did not cause the low Nile floods, but it removed buffers that could have softened the crisis. With fewer external inputs and fewer economic options, communities became more dependent on local harvests at the exact moment those harvests were failing. Economic isolation helped push a centralized kingdom toward fragmentation. The Old Kingdom's end was a process of gradual dissolution rather than a single dramatic conquest. As central authority weakened, regional rulers acted like independent kings, and Egypt's unity fractured into competing power zones. Administrative continuity broke down, taxation became inconsistent, large-scale building ended, and royal commands carried less force outside the core regions. Urban centers that depended on state organization declined as people sought security near local leaders or in areas with better agricultural conditions. Temples and local institutions took on roles once managed by the royal court, but they could not recreate nationwide coordination. Over time, the political map of Egypt changed into a patchwork of rival regions, marking the transition into the first intermediate period. The collapse was visible in everyday life. Fewer state projects, weaker enforcement, shifting loyalties, and declining confidence in the old divine order. Egypt did not disappear, but the old kingdom system, the pyramid-building, highly centralized model, ceased to exist. The Old Kingdom collapsed because its primary foundation, predictable Nile flooding, failed repeatedly and for long enough to break the state's core functions. When the Nile did not provide, agriculture declined, surpluses disappeared, and the central government lost the resources that powered administration, labor organization, and national coordination. From that main cause flowed the cascade: economic contraction, weakened legitimacy of divine kingship, growing autonomy of nomarchs, and the breakdown of unified governance. Secondary pressures, inequality, social distrust, and reduced trade accelerated the process by removing the buffers that might have stabilized society during crisis. The outcome was not the end of Egypt, but the end of a particular system, a highly centralized kingdom capable of building pyramids through national organization and shared belief. The lesson is clear and enduring. Even the strongest states depend on environmental stability, and when the natural base collapses, political authority and social unity can unravel with surprising speed.